Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this year's second Bartlett School of Planning public lecture. The format of this year's series, as many of you already know, is rather different from that of previous years. All the lectures are online. My name is Nick Gallant. I'm Professor of Housing and Planning here at UCL, and I will chair this evening's event. So our public lectures are intended to bring leading international thinkers and practitioners on topics related to planning and the built environment before an audience of colleagues, students and guests. Last month, we welcomed Professor Rebecca Chu from the University of Hong Kong, who shared her research on urbanism and older people's mental well-being. In addition to this evening's lecture, the programme for the rest of the year will include Maria Adebowale-Schwartz from the Foundation for Future London, speaking on a topic that is still to be confirmed, but is likely to focus on placemaking in London. Professor Libby Porter from RMIT, speaking on the precarities of dwelling in the settler colonial city, and Professor Anne Forsyth from Harvard University, who will give this year's Sir Peter Hall lecture on healthy cities after COVID. So please have a look at our website for details of the programme, and we hope to see you at future events. It's been our custom on these occasions to offer you some hospitality, usually available in the South Cloisters in the Wilkins building at UCL after the lecture and after the concluding discussion. Sadly, as you probably already guessed, that's not going to happen this year, but we hope to see you again in person in future events. So let me now introduce our speaker for this evening. Desiree Fields gained her PhD from the City University of New York in 2013 and was afterwards based here in the UK at the Department of Geography at the University of Sheffield between 2014 and 2019. She was then appointed to the post of Assistant Professor of Geography and Global Metropolitan Studies at the University of California in Berkeley. Desiree is on the board of the Urban Studies Foundation and is a core partner in the Housing Justice in Unequal Cities network led by Ananya Roy. Her research explores the financial technologies, market devices, and historical and geographic contingencies making it possible to treat housing as a financial asset, and how this process is contested at an urban scale. Her core interest is how financial capitalism unevenly restructures urban and social relations, with a particular concern for how urban struggles for justice coalesce around these challenges. How housing financialization has been reconfigured to target rental housing post the 2008 era is now a major focus of her work. And within that, she looks at the role of digital technologies in constructing a new asset class in the rental market. Building on that work, she is now seeking to understand the financialization of housing in terms of racial capitalism, which will be the focus of her talk this evening. Indeed, the title this evening, Racialized Geographies of Housing Financialization. There will, of course, be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. You can either type these into the Q&A and I will ask them, or, and I would encourage you to ask them directly and we will manage that process and unmute you. So without further ado, Desiree, welcome to UCL and the Bartlett School of Planning, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Nick. I'm really happy to be here with all of you. I just took a peek at the attendee list and I can see some familiar names and faces in that list. So happy to see all of you. And I will go ahead and get started. So let me start sharing my screen. And I should mention that the paper that I'm presenting today is co-authored with Elora Raymond, who is at Georgia Tech University. So I just wanted to make that clear. So I will kind of alternate sometimes between saying I and we in this paper, not out of any like clear intention to distinguish arguments that are mine versus ours, but just because sometimes I say I and sometimes I say we. Hope that makes sense. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Okay. So this paper seeks to make an intervention in the scholarship that is concerned with housing financialization. So just to get some definitions out of the way, broadly, housing financialization refers to a process by which the development, ownership, operation, management of housing is treated principally in impersonal financial terms as opposed or in addition to as a site of shelter and social reproduction. In other words, financialization treats housing as an interest-bearing asset, a flow of future income, securing instruments such as bonds and derivatives, or as the basis for capital gains. So today I'm going to make 4 arguments about this process of housing financialization. And the first is that financialization needs racial capitalism. By this, I mean that theories of racial capitalism stand to deepen the production of knowledge about housing financialization, and in so doing to support struggles for housing justice. Second, I argue that racial capitalism needs financialization. In other words, today, the process of financialization broadly in the economy, but also specifically within housing, is a central means of reproducing capitalist social relations, which, as Ruthie Gilmore argues, are always racialized. Third, the 2008 crisis served as a crucial moment in the reformulation of racial capitalism, in that post-2008 projects of housing financialization have extended beyond mortgaged homeownership, but in ways that maintain long-standing hierarchies of race and value. And finally, we draw on Black radical and Black feminist thought to argue that if we want to resist financialization and conceive housing justice, analyses of racialized geographies of housing financialization must work against dispossession and domination as the dominant framing. Okay, sorry, I'm just having a little bit of trouble with my notes, so just give me a moment. Okay, so a bit about the motivation for this work. On the one hand, there is no shortage of empirical work documenting racialized inequalities in housing markets, especially after the 2008 financial crisis. On the other hand, significant theoretical and conceptual interventions have helped us think about financialization as a phenomenon that is once structural and embodied, as variegated yet global, as a historically situated and contestable practical accomplishment. But very little scholarship in either of these hands has sought to explain the empirical facts on the ground by grappling with the fundamental interconnection between capitalism and racism. Political scientist Michael Dawson recently argued that this most central insight of racial capitalism, the entanglement of racism and capitalism, that this insight has not been thoroughly developed in relation to financialization generally, nor, as Elora Raymond and I argue, has it been developed in relation to housing financialization specifically. For example, a recent high-level review of financial geographies of housing and real estate hardly mentioned race, including just one reference to increasing indebtedness, quote, among more vulnerable groups, including but not limited to racial ethnic minorities, migrants, elderly women, and a range of social groups vulnerable to labor market shocks, end quote. How can we witness the role of housing financialization in racialized social inequalities and fail to contend with racial capitalism? And how can we move toward housing justice without recognizing how struggles for justice are, as geographer of the Black Mediterranean Camilla Hawthorne notes, these struggles are mediated by experiences of racialized economic dispossession. I argue that financial violence is racial violence. It is impossible to consider the trajectory of post-2008 financialization without attending to how it depends on and reproduces hierarchies of racial difference and perpetuates racialized dispossession. But it is equally important to avoid the trap of reducing racially subordinated communities to their experiences of oppression and domination. In order to formulate an emancipatory politics of housing, our analytic frame must also include housing movements led by Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. If you excuse me for just one moment, I'm just going to reorganize my notes because they're giving me quite a bit of trouble. Thanks for bearing with me here. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the scholarship on housing financialization. So it is common for work concerned with housing financialization to feature race at various scales, right? So individuals, households, neighborhoods. It's common for this work to feature race as a variable without examining the logics underpinning the uneven impacts of what Manuel Albers has called the real estate financial complex on Black and Brown people and places. Allowing race to stand in for racism in this way neglects how racial difference has always driven the production of value in capitalism, including in housing markets. Chakravarti and De Silva's query, what is it about Blackness and Latinidad that turns one's house, roof, protection, and aspiration and shelter into a death trap? This question evokes precisely this history. Their question foregrounds how racism's defining feature, in Ruthie Gilmore's words, the hierarchical and death-dealing abstraction of difference, how this operates within housing. So housing financialization seeks to abstract away from history and lived experience by quantitatively grouping, representing, and differentiating assets and social relations. Despite this process of abstraction, financialization does not lie outside of history or the social. Like other strategies of capitalist urbanization, such as redlining, urban renewal, and social mixing, geographies of housing financialization spatialize hierarchies of death-dealing racial difference. Yet the long supply chains and numerous intermediaries involved in financial accumulation create distance between the actors initiating and enabling financializing projects and the often violent impacts of these projects on the ground. This abstraction does not merely rationalize and disembed housing and property from social relations. It obscures the violence of displacement and dispossession and legitimizes the reproduction of racial hierarchies in housing and property. Resisting financialization and conceiving housing justice requires that we grapple with the spatial form that racial oppression takes, while also recognizing the spatial imaginaries that transcend such hegemony. The relationship between racial differentiation and capital accumulation has been incompletely theorized throughout the voluminous literature concerned with financialization. This scholarship draws primarily on critical political economy, namely David Harvey's geographic interpretations of Marxist theory. A central distinction between this starting point and theories of racial capitalism and settler colonialism is how primitive accumulation, or accumulation by dispossession, is theorized. Harvey's concept of accumulation through dispossession.
I'm sorry to pipe up, but we can only see part of your screen. It's truncated. I just
Oh, really?
We can see the whole of it now. Yes.
Oh, perfect. Okay, sorry about that. Okay. Sorry, I normally do this on a larger screen. Okay, let me just fix it a little. Okay, can you still see the whole thing? Can you still see the whole thing?
That's okay now. Yes, that's okay.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. Right, so Harvey's concept of accumulation through dispossession emphasizes, quote, the continuous role and persistence, end quote, of primitive accumulation within capitalism. In other words, primitive accumulation was not only needed to jumpstart capitalism. Capitalism must routinely turn to dispossession of non-capitalist or underdeveloped places and populations as a means of staving off crisis and securing further accumulation. However, Harvey's work does not attribute any kind of racialized character to accumulation by dispossession, or at least this isn't kind of a central part of the theory. And so scholars of financialization regularly invoke the concept of accumulation by dispossession as a means of understanding the coercive and violent waves of evictions and foreclosures seen in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. Manuel Albers and colleagues have also theorized the financialization of rental housing in terms of accumulation by dispossession. In their framework, financialization 1.0 involves, quote, the original acquisition of decommodified and not fully commodified land and real estate by opportunistic investors using aggressive strategies. The primitive accumulation of financialization 1.0 enables financialization 2.0, which incorporates property into systems of long-term investment and rentiership, such as publicly listed real estate investment trusts. So financialization 1.0 and 2.0 are understood here as two moments in a broader cycle of accumulation by dispossession. But again, this cycle is conceptualized without reference to processes of racialization, racial hierarchies, racism, etc. Accounts of racial capitalism therefore offer a critical intervention to how accumulation by dispossession can be theorized within work dealing with housing financialization. prior to David Harvey's work, Cedric Robinson was already, or kind of at the same time as Harvey was kind of initiating these theories, Cedric Robinson was already characterizing primitive accumulation as a continuous process within capitalism, while also demonstrating how capitalism initially unfolded in, quote, essentially racial directions, as have successive regimes of accumulation. Accounts of racial capitalism underline how, in the words of Stuart Hall, quote, capitalist modernity has always advanced as much by the production and negotiation of difference as it has through enforcing sameness, standardization, and homogenization, end quote. This logic of difference underpins a hierarchical ordering of society. Those seen as most similar to the dominant group are assigned higher status and seen as more valuable. Those seen as different from the dominant group are assigned lower status and less value. And this resulting hierarchy supports a process of racialized expropriation of both labor and land. Throughout the history of capitalism, such expropriation has disadvantaged racialized in relation to white subjects, or subjects who are racialized as non-white versus white, peripheral in relation to core global regions, and economically underdeveloped in relation to developed regions within nations. So just to summarize here, both the Marxian and Black radical traditions stress accumulation by dispossession as a continuous process and one that is structurally necessary to capitalism. But the Black radical tradition helps us understand how racial hierarchies of value have always shaped the socio-spatial contours of this process. This theoretical orientation can help us attend to how a logic of difference animates the strategies, tactics, and consequences of housing financialization. Drawing on theories of racial capitalism can also better historicize our analyses by placing contemporary processes of financialization in a longer, unbroken succession of what Keeanga-Yamada Taylor calls race for profit schemes in land and housing. Undertaken to preserve or restore profitability to capital, such schemes stretch back to the frontier and the plantation. Accepting that the production of racial difference is core to the production of value in capitalism entails recognizing the spatiality of this process. In other words, the way in which racial capitalism produces what, in Ida Danowide's words, produces some people and places as surplus in a way that is central to capitalism in all its incarnations, including our present finance-dominated era. In capitalist societies, racial division and racial subordination have always been necessary to producing value through real estate. The institution of private property is key to the operation of racial capitalism, especially in settler societies like the United States. Forged in the crucible of colonialism and slavery and evolving together with notions of race, private property is a crucial apparatus of dispossession. As Brenna Bandar argues, contemporary understandings of property are rooted in, quote, the attribution of value to the lives of those deemed as having the capacity, will, and technology to appropriate, which in turn was contingent on prevailing concepts of race and racial difference, end quote. In this way, property not only makes space into a commodity, it also produces racial subjects with differing rightful claims to space. Discourses of Black aspatiality, as Adam Bledsoe and Willie Wright say, and Indigenous non-being, as Nama Blotman Thomas and Libby Porter say, these discourses render Black and Indigenous geographies available for emerging modes of accumulation through property. The occupants of racial capitalism's wastelands and edge spaces are understood as doubly incapable on the one hand of appropriating land and incapable on the other hand of making home. And so willful practices of destruction that imperil subaltern geographies are intertwined with discourses of decay, contamination, deterioration. These discourses are regularly used to classify such places as in need of being made habitable. Devalorization thus ushers in revalorization and successive rounds of accumulation, making racial violence through the systematic, finance-mediated underdevelopment of Black spaces routine and ordinary. Such violence is integral to creating opportunities for appreciation and value growth in real estate markets. The settler colonial history of property in the Americas is inextricable from racial differentiation and subordination. Subordination. I don't know why I keep saying that. Kesu Park's study of foreclosure in colonial America demonstrates how the 2008 crisis is intimately tied to settler colonial commodification of property and the theft of indigenous land. Park analyzes how English colonists exploited differences in indigenous conceptions of land and value to deliberately extend unpayable debts and induce indigenous people to mortgage their land. At the same time, colonists transformed longstanding English legal practices that made it difficult to alienate debtors from land. By restructuring property law to be dispossessory, i.e. normalizing the seizure of land to recover debt, they forged a new American conception of land as fungible commodity. But we not only dwell with this history of how chattel slavery and settler colonialism shaped real estate in generations past. These racializing logics still reverberate and remain fundamental to the operation of finance in contemporary housing markets. Late 20th and early 21st century practices of predatory mortgage lending are inseparable from the violence of the plantation and of settler colonial expansion, as is the now nearly unquestioned notion of land as money. So by now, I hope I have demonstrated that financialization is properly understood in terms of racial capitalism. And now I want to turn to how financialization reproduces racial capitalism through techniques of abstraction. And here we're guided by Ruth Gilmore's insight that racism is, quote, a practice of abstraction, a death-dealing displacement of difference into hierarchies that organize relations. Linking speculative global finance and the reproduction of racial hierarchies in social life, housing financialization is a key site of racist abstraction. In the 21st century, financialization combines finance, data, and digital technology with racial hierarchies. The result is what Ruha Benjamin describes as the new Jim Code, in which race is abstracted into risk by innovating digital technologies, where algorithmic bias is hidden or covered over with the veneer of automated objectivity. Today's colorblind financial systems mark a shift from earlier eras, when racialization processes mapped race into the body and onto the skin, employing epistemologies based on sight and naturalizing the resultant caste system with claims of medical and scientific objectivity. Such mapping also projected racialization onto space, for example, through redlining maps that indexed investment risk to observations of racial ethnic population flux or stasis. Today, technologies such as credit reporting databases, rather than skin color per se, are the system in which credit is priced and allocated to individuals and places. Often these models compare individuals to statistical models so that stratification is not based on individual histories, but on statistical associations to risk factors. Nevertheless, such models continue to price, allocate, and deny access to housing and property in ways that map closely with racial divides. Segregation, dispossession, and displacement are actualized through abstract, seemingly colorblind financial processes, allowing contemporary financial systems to produce disparate impacts while denying any role in differentiating between racialized bodies or places. And so as racial formations transition and are incorporated into digitized financial systems, the assumed objectivity and opacity of software and algorithms provides the naturalness that biological sciences once provided. The institutional complexity and black box nature of financial systems operates as a screen over the violence of displacement and deprivation occurring in commodified housing systems. As Sage Ponder and Michael Almstedt observe, the harms resulting from financialization, quote, are rarely recognized as violent because they frequently lack immediately identifiable perpetrators and/or relations of cause and effect, end quote. So this abstract violence is often attributed to objective market conditions rather than the social relations that produced racialized expropriation. So the effect is to make financial violence invisible. So the use of finance to enact racial hierarchies is not new, of course. These practices stretch back into the dawn of imperial capitalism. But what is new since the late 20th century is the combination of finance with automated and digitized technologies as a means of governing the allocation of investment, wealth, landed property, and access to place. Housing financialization reconfigures the death-dealing abstraction of racism, shifting it away from systems of individual bias and racialized bodies and into automated systems. In the 2000s, the system of extraction through racialized abstraction moved toward crisis. The volume of loans needed to keep the securitization machine running in the years leading up to 2008 meant that financial tactics historically applied to Black urban spaces were rolled out to Sunbelt suburbs and growing shares of white mortgage borrowers. Subsequently, nearly 8 million households went through foreclosure between 2007 and 2017. The foreclosure crisis briefly overspilled longstanding racial geographies of dispossession wrought by financial tactics. This led Elvin Wiley and colleagues to argue in 2012 that, quote, the devastation wrought by deregulated mortgage capital threatens the home equity premium so long promised by American white privilege. But more than a decade after 2008, the crisis can clearly be understood not as a moment of exception from racial capitalism, but a moment in its replication and reformulation. And we can see this reformulation happening in the rental market primarily, largely through contract sales and evictions led by private equity investors. After the violence of racialized dispossession authored by predatory mortgage lending practices, these private equity investors are resurrecting racially exploitative mechanisms of home purchase and undertaking aggressive eviction practices in ways that continue to make home a racialized death trap. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two different examples of post-2008 housing financialization and try to think about analyzing these with a framework of racial capitalism. So I think we're all probably aware that the status of housing as a financial asset has only been entrenched since 2008. And this is largely due, at least in the US, to the federal government largely ceding recovery to the market and years of record low interest rates that have encouraged the growth of alternative investment strategies, including real estate and private equity. Meanwhile, the turnover, disinvestment, and housing insecurity affecting Black neighborhoods through the 2008 crisis and the uneven recovery has created surplus space for accumulation. The return of land contract sales after 2008 highlights the importance of attending to how a logic of hierarchical difference operates in housing financialization and observing the continuity of this logic across different eras of capitalism. Land contracts, or contract for deed, enable buyers without access to mainstream mortgage financing to buy a home by putting money down and paying in monthly installments, but they only receive title and start to build equity once they have paid off the principal in full. So it's kind of a version of renting to own. A contract for deed was widespread as a means for Black people to buy homes in the segregated real estate markets of the pre-Fair Housing Act 1950s and 60s. And contract for deed is associated with abusive terms and practices that often lead to repossession. These terms and practices include high interest rates, wide latitude to evict buyers, and the sale of properties that are unfit for habitation. Land contract sales of the 20th century were made possible by the projection of racial hierarchies onto space, which subsequently starved Black geographies of access to mortgage credit. Today, as Akers and Seymour argue, quote, the land contract has returned as an instrument for finding profit in otherwise devalued landscapes, end quote. And so a broad range of actors have long deployed land contracts, but the bulk disposition of foreclosed homes by public institutions after 2008 has allowed new actors to engage in contract sales. And these new actors are nationally coordinated private equity firms who are able to raise capital from wealthy investors and pension funds. Investors engaging in contract selling are most active in Black metropolitan areas and Black neighborhoods. These are landscapes that were destabilized by predatory subprime lending in the foreclosure crisis, then shut out of recovery from the Great Recession, now beset by negative equity and low value properties that banks have all but stopped financing. So buyers in these communities are made vulnerable by their poor credit or incomes that are insufficient to qualify for traditional mortgages, as well as limited access to mainstream financial institutions. Acting in the market created when government agencies and mortgage giants Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac began to sell entire portfolios of repossessed homes to investors, firms such as Harbor, Stonecrest, and Vision are engaging in the same kinds of practices that local actors were using in the mid-20th century. They are selling derelict homes at high interest rates, issuing contracts that offer little protection to buyers, and selling homes at substantial markups from their acquisition costs, but without making improvements to the property. And so under this business model, buyers often forfeit the contract and leave the property after being unable to make repairs or comply with local ordinances, but not before using up their savings or taking on more debt. And so the churn of tenants in and out of the same property tipped it into further disrepair. The resurfacing of contract sales wielded by corporate investors links numerous moments in the long history of racial capitalism while also adding to it. And you can see in this juxtaposition of images of Chicago here, right? So we have the Contract Buyers League, arguing that real estate exploitation produces ghettos. This is in 1968. And the work of Akers and Seymour documenting the ways in which contract for deed sales are popping back up in these same Black geographies that were affected by contract for deed in the 1960s, right? So this kind of the same mechanism, but being wielded by a different set of actors in the same geographies or similar geographies. Okay, so while one set of private equity firms is reviving contract selling, another set is becoming more traditional landlords. So global investment giants like Blackstone, Cerberus, Colony Capital have become some of the nation's biggest property owners through buying foreclosed single-family homes by the thousands and then converting them to rental housing. Unlike traditional landlords, these actors are not just collecting rent checks, they are bundling them into financial assets similar to mortgage-backed securities, and also selling shares in real estate investment trusts. In binding tenants into relationships with bondholders and shareholders, corporate landlords are adjusting the social relations of rent to better accommodate financial accumulation. So whereas the contract selling that I just spoke about is more deeply entrenched in the Midwest and the Rust Belt, so kind of the middle of the US, the geography of corporate landlords tilts more toward the Sun Belt, so places in the south and west of the country, cities like Phoenix, Dallas, Tampa. These are places that generally have a greater supply of newer homes compared to the Rust Belt. And so within this Sun Belt geography, single-family rentals have grown the most in older, racially and ethnically diverse suburbs. These are places that experienced low property values before 2008, more foreclosures during the crisis, and a slower recovery afterwards. Despite the largely divergent regional geographies of contract sales on the one hand and private equity single-family landlords on the other, both are contributing to racialized housing precarity. And in the case of corporate landlords, the mechanism for this precarity is evictions. The practices of corporate single-family landlords demonstrate the central role of abstraction via automated and digitized technologies in the current form of financial racial capitalism. The scale of their operations, so owning tens of thousands of properties, means that these actors rely on acquisition algorithms to evaluate properties and neighborhoods for investment, digital platform infrastructures to manage properties and tenants at a distance, and automated eviction filings to govern compliance with rent payment schedules. These technologies incorporate and reproduce enduring patterns of racial domination. And this is a point evident both in the geography of single-family rental portfolios and in the material impacts of eviction. While Matt Desmond's work has shown that eviction is alarmingly common, in Desmond's research, landlords have a face, right? So they're people. Eviction is even more routine for tenants of large, faceless institutional investors like American Homes for Rent and Invitation Homes. In Atlanta, such corporate landlords were more than 3 times as likely to initiate eviction compared to mom and pop landlords, so landlords that own 1 or 2 properties. In Memphis, which is where this the map on this slide is showing, in Memphis, a city with one of the highest percentage Black populations in the country and the greatest decline in owner-occupied homes since 2008, private equity firm Cerberus Capital Management has become the largest landlord of single-family rental homes through its company First Key. And the company files for eviction much more aggressively than other area landlords. And as this map shows, their eviction filings are concentrated in majority non-white neighborhoods. So where these circles are, the brown circles are kind of concentrated on the bottom right-hand side and a little bit on the left-hand side of the map near the airport, and then kind of closer to the top of the map. So the eviction practices of corporate landlords really echo the practices that loan servicers used in the 2008 crisis. And this parallel is like endlessly fascinating to me. Mortgage servicers were really motivated to draw out the process of foreclosure because it allowed them to garner additional profits through tacking on fees and charges to mortgage arrears. And this buried homeowners deeper in debt and made it harder for them to stay in their homes. For corporate landlords, the scale of their portfolios means they can substantially increase their income through routine automated eviction filings that pile late fees, court fees, and other costs onto past due rent. Even if, like Cerberus's Memphis portfolio, their properties are beset by housing code violations. So Invitation Homes generated about $2 million of revenue through automated eviction filings in 2017. And as you can see, so this narrative on the slide is from the work of journalists Frankel and Keating, who focused on Memphis. And you can kind of see the way that, an original past due rent balance of roughly $1,000 grew to over $2,000 through adding on late fees, attorney fees, and other costs, right? So you can see that when you have a portfolio on the scale of thousands of properties, these kinds of small fees and charges can really become a meaningful income stream. So in the current phase of racial capitalism, this kind of violence of eviction, but also the violence of kind of, extraction in this way is implemented abstractly, right? It's worked through the assumed neutrality and objectivity of algorithmic systems. Nonetheless, these systems produce intimately felt material impacts of eviction for racially subordinated communities that have already been sacrificed to financial accumulation many times over. Financial tactics of accumulation via the housing market have shifted following the foreclosure crisis, extending beyond mortgage lending to include speculative bulk ownership of homes by financial actors. Despite involving some different tactics than before the crisis, post-2008 housing financialization demonstrates the persistence of what Ananya Roy calls foundational dispossession, wherein tenuous claims to personhood make home, in Roy's words, quote, a lived experience of loss, or as Chakravarti and De Silva say, a death trap. Financial violence is racial violence. Because financial capitalism is fundamentally a project of racial domination, studying and theorizing housing financialization demands understanding this process in terms of racial capitalism. While I relate empirical examples from the United States, which has obviously a very specific history of slavery and settler colonialism, neither racial capitalism nor financialization is unique to the United States. Critical accounts of housing financialization emphasize capitalist dynamics of dispossession, but rarely acknowledge the racial hierarchies that co-evolved with capitalism and private property, and the racial practice on which capitalism still depends today. And so the consequences of this blind spot are twofold. First, geographies of housing financialization often neglect how, and I'm quoting Chakravarti and De Silva here, how, quote, new territories of consumption and investment have been mapped onto previous racial and colonial discourses and practices, end quote. This omission is no doubt a result of historical frames largely limited to the late 20th and early 21st century. Such analyses reinforce the mistaken notion of our current period of financial capitalism as exceptional. In so doing, they neglect how contemporary financialization contains and reproduces racial logics and violence embedded in capitalism since its inception. Scholarship on housing financialization must contend with the longstanding function of what Aaron McElroy calls, quote, property as a technology of racial dispossession. Without this history, the politics of 21st century processes of racialized banishment and accumulation are illegible. Second, the failure to theorize financialization in terms of racial capitalism also challenges the formulation of emancipatory politics. Characterized by colorblind techniques of financial abstraction that, in Ruthie Gilmore's terms, quote, displace difference into hierarchy, end quote, financialization perpetuates the division and differential subordination of white and non-white places. However, analyzing racially subordinated communities solely in terms of their experience of oppression and domination can serve to reify these differences. This is an analytic dead end that, quote, reduces Black life to the violence and terror practiced by white people, real estate, and public policy. That's Keeanga Yamada Taylor. Such a path only reproduces the abstract violence of financialization by excluding from the frame the Black radical tradition contained in culture, history, and social consciousness. Collective resistance and emancipatory social change is not carried out by the abstracted and aggregated assets that are the basis for financial capitalism. It is carried out by embodied and emplaced people with a shared consciousness shaped by, in Cedric Robinson's words, historical struggles for liberation. As we exit the post-foreclosure crisis recovery period and tilt into yet another housing crisis, this one driven by the COVID-19 economic recession, it's crucial to remember the lessons of the past decade. Centering Black, Brown, and Indigenous housing struggles is core to understanding techniques of economic subordination through housing and financial markets. This attention to struggle brings into the frame, quote, people who have deep and complex bonds with place, with the land they live upon. That's Maggie Ramirez. These bonds at once exceed and are undermined by financialization. So take the work of Moms for Housing, a group of homeless and marginally housed Black mothers who in late 2019 occupied a vacant West Oakland, California home owned by a corporate investor. Their struggle does not only expose the violence of fix and flip investors capitalizing on longstanding and recent dispossession to revalorize a historically Black neighborhood. It also demonstrates what Catherine McKittrick terms an oppositional geography produced by Black women. Member Talani King, pictured on this slide, asserted claims to a home in Oakland, not in Stockton, not in Brentwood, not in Antioch, but in Oakland, in terms of her humanity and a politics of care and belonging. She states, quote, I am someone. I deserve a house. I am a human being. I have lived in this community. I grew up here. I deserve to live in Oakland. In expressing this sense of place, Moms for Housing lay, and here I draw McKittrick again, lay, quote, demands on spatial arrangements and contest, respatialize, and inhabit the uninhabitable, producing new forms of life that assert new geographic formulations, end quote. Bringing such struggles into our frame of analysis decenters the abjection that normatively characterizes scholarship on the geographies of racially subordinated groups. Scholars across geography, urban studies, and planning have attended perceptively to the process of financialization and how it has overflowed mortgage homeownership to shape rental housing and other forms of dwelling. This work can be strengthened by engaging with the framework of racial capitalism to better historicize housing financialization and its attendant dispossession. That is, financialization may be placed in a much longer line of land and housing schemes where capital accumulation is predicated on the racialization of people and place. This perspective brings questions of property as a site of racial domination into the scholarship on housing financialization. And these questions, I think, are particularly important as digitized financial techniques naturalize and put an objective face on racial violence. However, it is also vital to shift away from reproducing this naturalization of violence in our own work and to move toward emancipatory geographies of housing. So I will end there and stop my share. Thanks for bearing with my technical difficulties on the notes and whatnot.
Thank you very much, Desiree. You've really brought a huge range of insights before the audience today. I'm going to open it up to questions right away. If you were physically in London, you would be enjoying some applause right now. So you have to imagine it, I'm afraid. So
I just want to say, I'm sorry. I just saw a note that someone was asking me to go slower, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to monitor the chat.
I didn't want to butt in and raise the issue, but I thought that if there's anything that people are not clear about, there's obviously the opportunity to ask questions now. I have one question which has come from Lucas Bainbridge. And he asks, to what extent do you think racialized property tax regimes, if you think such things exist, interact with the issue of reinforcing subordinated racial housing spatialities? So is there something also within property tax regimes that may reinforce some of the patterns that you've highlighted today?
That's a great question. And I don't know the answer because I haven't actually studied property tax regimes very much. I know that that one thing I've looked into or started to look into just a tiny little bit is the way in which corporate landlords, such as Blackstone and some of the actors that I mentioned in my talk, the way in which they try to manipulate the property tax system in order to contest their property tax valuations, right? And so actors like Blackstone, or not Blackstone, Invitation Homes, actors who own a significant amount of property may be able to leverage the scale of their portfolios in order to be responsible for a lower amount of property tax than, say, an individual homeowner might. And, we can also think about, kind of like going back in time a little bit. I'm just thinking about the urban crisis of New York City in the 1970s and 80s, was largely mediated through property taxes or real estate taxes, and landlords who stopped paying their taxes on their properties had their buildings seized by the city, right? So it was a tax foreclosure process. This is also something that we saw happening in Detroit after the 2008 crisis, right? And so, in both instances, both in New York in the 70s and 80s and in Detroit in the aftermath of 2008, these were, the impacts of tax foreclosure were deeply racialized and, largely affecting Black and Brown people and communities.
So maybe this is something we could brainstorm on really and think about this interaction. And maybe it's a sort of direction for future research as well. My colleague, Fulong Wu, asks, what is the role of the state in this process of racial capitalism? In the US,
yeah.
we can think about it more broadly, but in the US.
Sure. I mean, so I would say one way that the state plays a huge role in this process, at least in the realm of, like my area of interest, which is housing, obviously, is through the institution of private property, right? So of course, like the state, underwrites, protects, serves the interests of private property. And, to the extent that these racial inequalities are, racial capitalism operates through the property markets, the state is like key here, right? And so, the way you can see this in the way in which, sheriffs are involved in enforcing eviction processes, right? So that's kind of like one example. If we think about, the post 2008 examples that I talked about in this lecture, we can think about the way in which the state, first of all, like didn't do enough in response to mortgage difficulties in the run up to 2008, and then kind of sold off properties en masse in ways that really allowed these actors to like revive contract sales, to own thousands and thousands of properties and, undertake evictions in ways that disproportionately affect Black and Brown people. So I would say those are some of the key ways. So obviously, like the role of the state through, their policy interventions or lack thereof in the aftermath of 2008, and in the ways in which the state protects and enforces the institution of private property.
Right. Two thoughts for the audience. If you'd like to ask questions live, you can do. And if you want to ask questions through the question and answer tab, please do that rather than the chat, because then we can manage the answering of the questions. Tommaso Gabrielli, my colleague at UCL, wants to ask a question live. Can he? Yes, he can. Here he is.
Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me clearly.
I can.
So thank you very much for the super interesting talk. I am even more convinced that there is a racial dimension of housing inequality. And I want to ask a question about policy implications, because I am an economist by background. I'm quite familiar with the literature in finance, and it is really the case that there are very few examples of, of research that goes specifically into this racial dimension. But I think that one of the reasons is that in the moment that one accepts that the free markets, the capitalist system produces inequalities, and nowadays even the so-called neoclassical economists would accept that the capitalist system produces inequalities, then of course in the moment in which you have racial minorities that are the economically disadvantaged, of course then you have a racial dimension of inequality. Okay, it's not to say that one cannot do anything about it, but it's just to say that in a way it is easy to mix it with all sorts of issues about inequality, lack of opportunities, poverty traps, so on and so forth. But my question is about specific policy implications, because my understanding is that when it comes to race, there are two main policy routes. One is affirmative action, and the other one is policies about discrimination. So about the second one, policies about discrimination, for example, there is a recent paper by Rosenthal that proves some small discrimination in the mortgage market. Is quite a recent paper, but it had a lot of buzz. But for example, that kind of effect that he finds is very small. And one could argue, okay, it is proved, one could have a specific policy about no discrimination in the mortgage market, but you could still have all sorts of manifestations of this racial dimension of inequality. And then one could argue, well, policies about affordability and things like that would help all the economically disadvantaged, including the minorities. So I spoke for a long time, but is there any specific policy implication that you can think about that tackles directly this racial issue, and not just broader issues around inequality, disadvantage, lack of opportunities, and the likes?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's sort of two ways to think about it. I mean, one is I'm not sure this is a problem that we can fix with policy, I guess. I feel like, yeah, I mean, I guess I feel like this is the ways in which hierarchies of racial value are so baked into every aspect of our housing system. So it's not just accessing mortgages, it's appraisals, it's sales, and so forth, right? So there's there's so many facets, and so you would have to have so many different policies, and it's not necessarily just active discrimination that we're talking about, right? It's this kind of the ways in which our entire society is structured around these racial hierarchies, right? And so I'm not sure that policy is going to really be the fix here. I think we need to think about embracing non-capitalist ways of relating to land and housing. And so one of I ended on this example of Moms for Housing, and the house that they occupied has since been purchased by the Oakland Community Land Trust, and is, will be a transitional space for homeless mothers, right? So I think those, if we're thinking about policies, solutions, I'm not sure that anti-discrimination policy is necessarily the best fix. So perhaps policies that would really lift up non-capitalist ways of relating to land and housing, such as providing acquisition capital to community land trusts in order to to buy properties, right? But we haven't really seen a lot of that. I think there's been some recent successes by the New York City Community Land Initiative, which helped start a community land trust in East Harlem, and they finally got the city to give them some properties, We have seen some housing occupations, not only the Moms for Housing occupation, but Camp Teddy in Philadelphia. And also, I can't remember the name of the group in LA, but they occupied a bunch of vacant homes that were on land owned by a transportation authority. And they are getting some success in getting those properties kind of like handed over to the community. So I think if you're interested in policy interventions, I would say like any kind of policy intervention that would support that kind of non-speculative community control over land and housing would be a really important start, rather than trying to target like discrimination in specific sectors of the housing market.
I think that's a really clear answer. Rob Hickman actually asked a very similar question about what sort of policies we might develop in response. But I think, you know, your broader point about rethinking land and capitalism and giving power to non-speculative forms of development and ownership, I think those are very important. So apologies to Rob. I'm going to skip that question because I think it would repeat Tommaso's. But I've got a question from Daniel Fitzpatrick, which you may be able to, I'm sure you will be able to answer based on your reflections from life in the UK. But what do you see as the characteristics of in the UK of racialized capitalism in housing in the past and today? And I think I'd add to that, is it just a mimic of the US, or are there different things going on as well?
I mean, so I will preface this by saying that most of my work has focused on the US, and I'm by no means an expert on housing in the UK. I would love to hear from you, Nick, or from other folks in the audience about this question. I would say that like my hunch is that we see these processes operating in the UK a bit differently than in the US. So I would guess that if we think about like what the racial hierarchy of value looks like in the UK, it might be ordered around people from South Asia being closer to the bottom of that hierarchy. We might also think about the diaspora of people from former colonies of the British Empire now living in the UK. We might think about refugees from Syria, the Middle East, different countries in Africa, right? So we might think about a racial hierarchy of value that that includes those kinds of groups at the bottom of the hierarchy, and even kind of perhaps somewhere in the middle. Migrants from Eastern Europe, places like Poland. And so I would guess that that's a little bit of what the picture looks like in the UK in terms of how the housing system is affected by racialized capitalism. But I'm so curious to hear what you think.
Well, I think you're probably right. I mean, it's not an area of research that I've got into, but certainly some of the redlining that has happened in the past certainly will be contiguous with the sort of geographies that you've described. I've got a question from Oren Yiftakal, and I think he wants to ask it live, so we'll bring him in. I think he's coming in.
Oh, hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
I can.
Yeah, it's good to be back at UCL after I was there for last year as a visiting professor, and thank you very much for the very enlightening lecture, and also the important connection of the critique that coming from radical racial studies and the Marxian perspective. And I think to some extent our discipline, geography and urban studies, for a while has been blind, whether it was Marxist or liberal, to the crucial importance of difference. I want to ask you theoretically, though, why focusing on race, or what is your comment? I mean, you already responded now about Great Britain in terms of other groups, but we in the Middle East, and my work on ethnocracies and on ethnic identity regime has produced similar results, and worked on ethnoclasses as a term that I worked with. What in comparative term we can look at, identity regime that intertwine with economic financialization, and how can we actually expand that beyond the US and the UK to other maybe post-colonial or colonial, presently colonial systems. And in particular, I want to ask about the issue of urban citizenship and how that relates to identity regimes and financialization, because we see spreading around the world urban systems that have apartheid regimes in them, that's the intersection of class and identity. For example, the Gulf states, where 70 or 80% of the population is not even citizens. For example, Jerusalem, where the Palestinians, the colonizer, don't have citizenship. So this is just a provocation to think beyond racial capitalism and to think about how identity and capitalism intersect elsewhere, and perhaps to broaden the lens to other regions where this can provide a better explanation to the differences and gaps that we see now expanding around the world.
Oren, thank you for that question. Yeah, I take your point on, on this idea that there are multiple facets of identity that intersect with capitalism in important ways. And I think in terms of how to expand this kind of analysis beyond the US and the UK, we might think about Israel-Palestine, right? And, the kind of the ways in which Palestinian people's land has been seized, how they're concentrated into like pretty contained areas. We might think about Brazil, right? And the dynamics of informal settlements versus more developed settlements, and like the racialization of informal settlements as often like indigenous or Afro-Brazilian. So I think like we can certainly, see these kinds of racialized inequalities in housing systems playing out more broadly in places beyond the US and the UK. I think these inequalities are like probably, I would guess these kinds of like the racial capitalist dimensions of housing and housing financialization. I think they are easier to see in settler colonial states, right? So if we look at like Australia, Canada, the US, Israel, Palestine, like parts of Latin America. So I think those are like the geographies where this analysis seems to make the most sense. But that's also, like a function of the limitation of my own knowledge and research, which again has focused largely on the US. But I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this as well, and to kind of think with me about how you see these dynamics playing out in other places. What do you think?
Well, I think that, as I said, I think we are actually moving in urban areas now for a new form of colonialism.
Yeah.
Coloniality, and I've written recently quite a bit about it. Even when I was in Britain, it's fascinating how we, in a way, retreat to regimes that were considered illegal or highly immoral just 60 or 70 years ago. And now we see, as I said, in the Gulf states, in Jerusalem, in Israel, Palestine, in the favelas, in Istanbul, in almost most cities, we see people that are differentiated, racialized as part of the urban regime. Now it's hidden, it's concealed by a system of, say, temporary migration or illegal housing, the whole new discourse. The development is channeled to the white population, if you like, or the version of the whites, wherever they are. And this is, we need to think about new vocabulary. I call it urban coloniality, and it's sort of returned through the back door, but Asef Bayat and Anania Roy and other people talked about it also in different terms. And
banishment and so forth, yes.
Yeah, and we really have to see how the very process of urban development now is a platform to create colonial-like relations, where you're separate and unequal on the base of who you were born, how you were born. And I think in the Middle East is a good laboratory for that. And let's collaborate on thinking about it in more theoretical terms that will bring, will bring that to the attention of planners and policymakers. It's something systematic and definitely worldwide.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Desiree, I'm going to throw a couple of questions at you together now. And I think the first one relates to what you've just been discussing. I have a question from Narasu Siraga, who asks, does racialized housing financialization happen only under the neoliberal system? And then not really related, but I'll put it together. Foulon comes back with another question, which is how is this racial dimension of financialization intertwined with class? I suppose like you could extend that to say, you know, what is the dominant schism, if you like.
Got it. Okay. Okay, so to the first question about whether racialized housing financialization happens only in a neoliberal system, I mean, you know, it depends a little bit on how we understand financialization. I mean, you know, like the, you know, so we could think about like, even if we go back to say like, you know, mid 20th century and the massive expansion of mortgaged home ownership, right? Like that kind of like, you know, increasing, you know, the expansion of mortgage debt could be potentially understood as a mode of housing financialization, right? That was not happening in the context of neoliberalism. And we still saw, of course, these like, you know, this is the era of redlining, of contract sales, and so forth. So the operation of racial capitalism in housing markets, like that's, you know, that's a very long history. That's not unique to financialization. And so I think what we see happening, you know, with racial capitalism, financialization, and neoliberalism, as we see, you know, perhaps new actors, new techniques. I think this, you know, this component of like, you know, this kind of the long chains of actors that characterize financialization, this element of distance between the actors, perpetuating financialization and the impacts of their projects on the ground. I think that is something that is like a new element in the context of financialization. But I think like racial capitalism and housing markets, like that's a long history. Fulong, so
On class.
right. So how do we see class intertwined with race here? They're intertwined. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Like, I mean, I would say like they're pretty like fundamentally intertwined, right? I mean, obviously, like there are, you know, like this is not to say that that race is like predictive of one's class position, but it is to say that the racial hierarchies of value that we see characterizing capitalism like does have some bearing on one's class position, right? And so yeah, like I'm not really sure like how else to answer that question.
Well, I think we could be here all night on that one, really. So we'll park it there for now. I have a methodological question from, oh, it's just disappeared. Lots of questions are coming in and they're disappearing. From Tabia Latoka. My question concerns methodological implications of researching housing financialization through the lens of racialized capitalism. What kind of methodological frameworks and scholar-activist relations have you explored, or do you see fruitful for advancing this agenda? So, what are the sort of broad methods that you bring to this work?
Yeah, so I would say like one big methodological insight from this work so far, and I have to say like this is work that's in formation for me rather than work that is like done and dusted. So, but I would say like one big methodological insight for me here is thinking historically. I think in a lot of my previous work, it was, you know, like more present, like more contemporary, maybe with some historical notes. And I think one big takeaway for me of like thinking with a racial capitalist framework is like, you know, very much attending to longer historical strains and how how these dynamics like are like a very long chain of developments, right? So I think work on financialization in particular is often like very present focused, and I think it can, because like we don't necessarily like often think about housing financialization as something that was happening in colonial America. But if you look at the work of K-Sue Park, that basically is what was going on, was the financialization of land. There was even like a secondary, like a secondary market of trading mortgages in order for colonists to, steal the land of indigenous people. So I think like that kind of historical lens is really valuable here, because it kind of helps, helps to like make and advance these kinds of claims. And to really observe like both the continuities of the dynamics of racial capitalism, and to kind of pick out like what is unique about, like any one era compared to another. So I think that's like the main answer for me. And then in terms of scholar activist relations here, I would really encourage you to look at the work that's happening through the Housing Justice in Unequal Cities Network, particularly the way in which the Luskin Institute on Inequality and Democracy at UCLA is partnering with the LA Community Action Network and others to really bring together people doing important work in the community around homelessness and dispossession broadly, and this idea of kind of like racial banishment, and like really bringing that work together with scholarship, right? So I would look at some of the recent reports coming out of the Luskin Institute as really great examples of scholar-activist relationships here.
Great, thanks. Just a comment from Michael Edwards that I'm going to share with you, and I'll go back to another question. In London, we have market relations dominating the housing system, 80% or more. I think he's talking about the power of big companies producing the housing, compared to 50 to 60% 50 years ago. So poorer people almost inevitably get less of the stock. Class and race map onto each other in complicated ways here. And I think, again, it's that issue that we could, go into at great length. A question then from Paul Boycher. With the next housing crisis unfolding, as you described, do you see an increase in community-based organizations adopting the pressing issue of evictions and the returning patterns of certain actions of financial actors, as you described, especially in communities of color? I think the question broadly is there an increasing sort of activist response to these issues? Is there an increase in the knowledge transfer or community learning to the more vulnerable communities and communities of color?
That's a big question.
But I think it really extends one of your earlier answers, which was beyond rethinking land and capitalism. There's this need for non-speculative, non-market power to sort of gain traction in these situations.
And I mean, so I would say like generally we see like eviction is of course on everyone's minds right now. And in many ways, COVID has kind of brought things to light that were like already happening, but has really like magnified and exacerbated, what's going on with evictions right now. And so I think, one of the things we are seeing is like, yes, like everyone's talking about evictions. I think the cancel rent movement is huge, and that's not necessarily tied to I don't necessarily see that kind of I don't see that movement as like consciously linking itself to this, the recurring patterns of financial actors, right? So like I don't necessarily see that movement linking up with like thinking about racial capitalism consciously. But that's not to say, that that's not a discourse that's happening within movements. In terms of an increase in knowledge transfer or community learning, I do think this is happening. I think there's a push to kind of foster a kind of like critical financial literacy. I think one of the things that we often see, like particularly after housing crises, is we often see this push for like greater financial literacy. And, you know, as if like the financial literacy is the problem rather than, you know, like the kind of like the structures that allow predatory lending and foreclosure to happen in the first place, right? And so I think like what we're starting to see is a kind of like push toward a critical financial literacy that is like focused on like really understanding how the financial system operates, right? One of the things that I have felt is really exciting is the work of Greater Manchester Housing Action. They've been doing a sustained popular education initiative that's been happening for over a year now, really involving people in trying to understand the process of financialization, how it manifests concretely in the urban environment of Manchester, and really trying to understand what this process looks like, where it comes from, and really trying to like build a popular consciousness around this process. Again, I'm not sure to what extent that popular education effort is like really focused on communities of color and racialized inequalities, but I think it's definitely focused on, like vulnerable communities more broadly. So I think there are exciting efforts here. I think, like the Moms for Housing example that I talked about earlier, that movement was like very like central to the way that they framed their movement was the foreclosure crisis, the dispossession of Black Oaklanders, tying it to the longer history of redlining, but also like really saying like this is a property that an investor has been sitting on, letting it be vacant when there are, when homelessness among Black people in Oakland is like a huge, like just a huge problem, right? And so I think, yes, like we do see, community movements like really starting to like frame their work around financial actors, and in the case of the Moms for Housing, like really putting those two together in a way that I haven't necessarily seen other movements doing.
Thanks. I'm going to throw just two more questions at you now. I have one from Amy. Well, I have two questions from Amy Horton, but I'm going to take the second part of her question because I think it links links more strongly to what we've been discussing. In terms of the investors or the financial actors who are involved in some of the sort of activities that you've been describing, are they now taking into account issues of climate change and the processes of devaluation that link to disasters and issues of insurability, and is that getting mixed up with their practices? And is it likely to? I'm trying to sort of formulate the question in a way that I understand. Is it getting mixed up in questions of race? Is it likely to make some of the patterns that you've described worse? Is it likely to lead to some sort of self-reflection, which may have a positive benefit in the future? If you can make sense of my reinterpretation of that question, then you've done very well.
So, hi, Amy. Great to see your question. I would actually love, I don't know if this will work, but I saw that Zach Taylor is here with us today. And Zach, I would say, is like really the expert here on investors, climate change insurance, and the way that all of this is racialized. So if Zach is willing to talk on this question, I would love for him to do that. Are you there, Zach? And do you want to talk?
He's coming immediately. Yeah, he's keen.
Hi, Zach.
You're muted.
Hi. Can the question be reframed? I am here, but I'm trying to think about how to respond.
I will read the question verbatim. Are some of these investors, I suppose, investors and financial actors, taking account of climate change and the processes of devaluation linked to disasters, insurability, and bracket internal or international migration, which of course are racialized?
Yeah, absolutely. We're starting to see examples of forward-looking investors, mostly pension funds, large capital providers forcing this conversation. It's mostly emanating from Europe, but not exclusively. Also some forward-looking, and to use the financial industry's language, forward-looking asset managers are beginning to think about their exposure. A question here is definitely devaluation, higher operating costs because of insurance or property taxes, questions of that nature. And we're starting to see questions about divestment from particular geographies that are considered to be too risky. And I think there are definitely some big questions about what that will entail for questions of race and equity across regions. Definitely questions about changing patterns of ownership and how that relates to race. I think a second area that's really important relates to insurance directly, and where insurance markets are entangled with these geographies of race and class. So just one quick example, in Miami, we see a lot of single family housing that is not necessarily the really luxurious flood prone stuff on the coast that we see in these glossy media features about places like Miami and climate change and sea level rise. A bit removed from the coast, these single family houses where the foreclosure crisis never really ended, right? We still have high rates of cost burdened households. We see high rates of institutional investor presence. Desiree talked about these kind of places in her lecture, these sort of areas with really diverse communities, relatively new homes where incomes are maybe not recovering still after the crisis. And as insurers begin to price climate risk or the cost of disasters into their policies, we're seeing that be potentially a vector of housing unaffordability. And I think there's a question here about a kind of contradiction playing out where insurance, this mechanism that's connected mostly to mortgaged houses, as intended to be a mechanism of protection, increasingly potentially becoming a mechanism of housing precarity. So there's this, I think, very racialized story of housing unaffordability that's connected with the sort of precarious space of non-white homeownership in places like Miami, and how that sort of precarious position might be undone by insurance and other forms of finance. It's a complicated question, but the answer is yes, financial markets are beginning to respond to this in different ways. You're seeing ripple effects across the real estate finance system. And I think the question of how that will all play out in a particular housing geography is a complicated one. It's an emergent one, and it's definitely something we need to pay attention to. Debates about things like climate gentrification, really, really important, but they haven't really focused on financialization. So we're still trying to figure that out. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much, Zach. And I have to apologize to Amy for butchering your question previously. It was much better articulated had I just read it. So apologies.
That was like a brilliant answer, Zach. I knew that you would do a much better job of answering that than I would. And just to briefly tack on a tiny other detail, which is just that if you look kind of historically in the US, a lot of the places where Black people live are called the bottoms. And these are places that are often, not only kind of spatially constrained, but are often vulnerable to exactly, they're often low-lying land, marshy land, vulnerable to flooding and the kinds of, environmental degradation, and the kind of destruction of environment that is associated with climate change, and environmental pollution and so forth, right? And so just that geography of where Black people live in the US, we can think about the way that might the way insurance might map onto that, for example, right? And the kind of migration that might be necessary as a result of more and more flooding, for example, right? And so I think this is something that needs to be explored more, as Zach pointed out, but kind of like thinking about this again, like this longer history of patterns of residential settlement and how racial capitalism has shaped those very patterns, then shaping, vulnerability to newer processes like climate change, and how that links up to like the insurance industry, for example. So it's like a messy picture, and one that we need to understand better.
Great, thanks. I'm just going to ask you one more question now, and I think I'm going to apologize in advance to those whose questions I haven't asked, but hopefully they could email you directly if they have particular issues,
Yeah.
or ideas or thoughts or whatever. But the question I want to end on is one from Callum Ward, who starts off by saying that your presentation was brilliant, which I thoroughly and wholeheartedly agree with. And he asks, we're hearing a lot in the UK about the emergence of prop tech. It's been discussed particularly around proposals to reform the planning system, but I know generally there is a broader industry around prop tech and financialization 2.0. Are there opportunities in new technologies to resolve some of the issues that you've raised today, or is the technology just tilted in such a way that it's likely to make them worse, or at least sustain them in the future?
Yeah, thanks for that. Hi, Callum, how you doing? Good to see you. So prop tech, yeah. So one of the things that I've been working on a little bit with Erin McElroy is this question of landlord technologies, how landlords in particular are using some of these prop tech developments. And I think one of the things that we are seeing is I think there's a big difference in terms of the way these properties are prop technologies, landlord technologies are applied and experienced. And I think that is I think that race is really wrapped up in that, right? So if you look at the example of Atlantic Plaza Towers, which is a housing development in central Brooklyn, New York. The landlord decided to bring in biometric facial recognition access systems that would, basically govern tenants' access to, to the property and to their apartments. And, the tenants, have really pushed back against this, arguing that it, kind of creates a sort of carceral experience of housing, right? And this, these kinds of technologies are explicitly marketed as a means of landlords protecting their investment and, better extracting value. And in particular, these kinds of biometric technologies are used as a means of basically catching tenants who might be violating the terms of their lease in order to facilitate eviction and, upgrading the unit, renting it for a higher rent, et cetera, right? So I think that use of, property technology is very different when it is imposed rather than actively chosen. And when it is not something that is chosen for convenience or efficiency or kind of reducing frictions, but is used to kind of further extract value through a kind of logic of surveillance, right? And so I would say that in general, the ways that we see landlords applying these sorts of property technologies in communities of color is often one that kind of reinforces the same kinds of racialized difference in housing that that are so longstanding. At the same time, I will say that there are many examples. Not many, but there are a growing number of examples of activist groups and nonprofit groups that are trying to leverage similar types of technological capabilities in order to build tenant power and push back against landlords and processes of financialization. So the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which many of you may be familiar with, is developing a project called the Victor Book. And the idea is to basically create a database that is kind of like a user-friendly interface that will allow tenants to research property owners, evictions, and like build connections between different buildings. There's another group called justfix.nyc. They have a tool called Who Owns What, which again is very similar. There's another group called Sage in Los Angeles that has a tool called Own It, again, very similar. And like the idea with all of these tools is to basically to kind of produce a greater transparency around property ownership and financial mechanics that are happening within rental housing. And I think, you know, if you look at the example of Atlantic Plaza Towers and, you know, many other examples of property technologies that are wielded by landlords, it's all about transparency into tenants' lives and homes. And, you know, I think, you know, these tools that are being developed by the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project and others are trying to kind of like turn the lens back onto landlords and the property market itself. And I think that is really crucial. And to, you know, to go back to my earlier response about kind of critical financial literacy, I think these kinds of platforms are really central to being able to develop that kind of critical financial literacy, because one of the big problems in the US as well as I believe in the UK is that it is just really hard to understand like who owns my building, what other buildings do they own, how could I get in touch with other tenants and figure out if they're having the same experience as I am. So, you know, whether Evictor Book is going to like unmake, you know, the financial, like the nexus of financial capitalism and racial capitalism, it's unlikely, but I think it's important to lift up these efforts because we tend to focus so much on, you know, on kind of like what the market is doing, what, you know, what is kind of like being pushed onto us. And so I think it's important to lift up these examples that are really trying to like turn the lens back onto corporate actors, property market actors, financial actors in order to build a kind of like critical knowledge from the ground up.
Great, thank you very much. Desiree, thank you also for sharing your research with us this evening. I think you've shone a light on a blind spot that certainly I had, and I'm sure others in the audience had as well. I want to thank audience members as well for asking you some brilliant questions, some of which I didn't fully understand, but when I asked them, I obviously you did. So thank you to everybody. We'd love now to invite you to join us for some drinks in the South Cloisters, but we'll have to invite you to join us next year. Hopefully that will be possible. So thank you again for your contribution. If you were here, you would hear rapturous applause at this stage. But thank you again for joining us this evening.
Thanks so much. Really happy to be here. And thanks to the audience for really great questions. I did my best to answer them, but you really developed some good ones. So I'll be thinking about these for a while to come. Thanks very much.
I think your answers have been really comprehensive this evening, and I think we all feel that this is a subject area that we're far more comfortable with, and perhaps even a little bit more competent with as well after hearing from you tonight. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, take care. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.